My name is Elizabeth Sykorowski. I'm a Sloan graduate, class of 1998. And I'm pleased to introduce our panel, our next panel discussion on entrepreneurship and innovation. Today's panelists will share their experiences taking an idea from concept to reality, and I think you'll find it's a diverse board. We're representing various examples of entrepreneurship and innovation in a corporate setting, in a high capital intensive setting, in a series of evolving concepts, bootstrapping. There's a variety of different ways that we can understand entrepreneurship and innovation. And so we'll move from the general, what are these different types, but also to the personal, what has it been like for each one of the panelists? And my hope is that it will inspire you and also be practical, that you'll be inspired to do something innovative and entrepreneurial in your life if you don't feel that you are now, and that you can learn something from this panel. Our moderator, Fiona Murray, is extremely well positioned to be our moderator. She is the Associate Dean for Innovation at MIT Sloan. She's the co-director of MIT's Innovation Initiative for the entire institute. She's the William Porter Professor of Entrepreneurship, faculty director of the Legatum Center, and she also serves on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology in the UK. She earned her bachelor's and master's from the University of Oxford in chemistry, and she holds a master's and PhD from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Fiona Murray and our panelists.
All right. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, everybody. I've officially been given an hour, but I think we have a little less than an hour until lunch. So we'll see whether we can move ourselves along with lots of rapid-fire conversation and discussion. Just to get us started, I think we all know there's a lot of evidence out there that entrepreneurship is really important in today's economy, both in the United States, all over Europe, and in most of the developing world. It's really the young companies that are actually the main engines of job creation in the economy. And it's the growth of those young companies. It's not just starting them, but it's growing them into big organizations that really makes a difference. And there's this amazing multiplier effect for every good job that these young, high-growth companies create. There are lots of other additional jobs that get created in the economy. MIT does a pretty good job of this, especially from Sloan. We know from our alumni survey that MIT alum-founded companies have created over 5 million jobs, and if it was an economy, it would be the 10th largest in the world. Some wonderful statistic. I'm not sure that statistic would hold up with analysis group, frankly. but we're doing our best, right? No, we will eventually get to several decimal places. But I think while that's tremendous for the economy, it's a real challenge for the founders and leaders of those companies, the people who found them and who grow those companies. This is something that requires real passion and perseverance. And so I wanted to start off by asking each of our panelists just to tell us a little bit about the core idea in the company that you have either founded or are growing. What problem are you solving? So I'm just going to go in order.
Thanks. So I'm Martha Amram, and my company is WattzOn. I have an Australian co-founder, so you could go WattzOn. But we started as a consumer engagement software in helping people save energy at home. And there's a market for that if you want to sell to utilities, which I find. I was a managing director at Navigant Consulting, and I did a lot of utility work, and that's a really long and laborious sales process. So we try to sell consumer engagement software. We've been used in cities around the country, in military housing, and people actually do save energy. But then we had to do a strategic pivot because the market's just not big enough. They won't pay enough. And so we took a piece of our technology, and now we're what I would call digital plumbing. So just in the way that bank account information needs to connect to Mint and other consumer applications for banking and payment services, we're the digital layer that connects your utility bill to a solar company platform or a smart home platform. And coming up soon is consumer credit, because utility bill payment history is highly predictive of your ability to handle credit. So just being that digital plumbing layer is our new business model.
Alex.
I'm Alex Wright-Gladstein, and I co-founded a company called Ayar Labs out of MIT with a group of researchers in the electrical engineering department at MIT a couple years ago. And we have figured out how to get computer chips to communicate using light instead of electricity. which makes computing much faster and reduces the amount of energy used in computing. So as an example, it has the potential to really dramatically reduce the amount of time it takes for AI, kind of machine learning training. You could cut it in half or even a quarter potentially by increasing the amount of data you can move between chips. And on the energy side, it has the potential to reduce the amount of energy used in computing in half. And computing is the fastest growing segment of energy use worldwide, so it has the potential to have a really big impact, which is why I got excited about this when I first met the inventors at MIT a few years ago.
Great, thank you.
I'm Catharina Lavers Mallet. I work with a company called Talla. We're an early stage startup that is looking at the problem of letting organizations take advantage of the insights and the efficiencies that are available through artificial intelligence applied to the knowledge that is held within an organization. So much of the challenge of coming up with enough data that you can have meaningful machine learning insights are actually very hard to capture. So helping organizations figure out how to annotate and label internal information, internal knowledge specifically, so that you can AI-ify it.
I like that. Sarah.
I'm Sarah Blank, and my company is Scanlan, Theodore, and we sell women's clothing, and we're dressing women for the workplace. So our sort of goal is to grow an existing company. Actually, it's an Australian company that's existed for 30 years, but I've partnered with the founder in Australia. So to grow that company and really give women good value, comfortable, beautiful, chic clothing for the workplace.
Great, thank you. Now, I want to pick up on a theme that I think Rohini mentioned when she was talking about her role on some of the private company boards, and this very fast fundraising cycle, having to raise money often every 18 months, sometimes being in that crisis of running out of funds. And we also know that the fundraising environment can be quite challenging on many, many dimensions. And so I wondered if I could ask each of you a little bit about how you've chosen to fundraise for the company and what kinds of approaches and what sort of capital sources you're using.
So when I started WattzOn, there were 125, I think we counted at one point, consumer energy engagement software companies. Like 3 or 4 of us have survived. We give each other hugs at conferences. And so it is really a challenge. And I don't have great answers because I've pitched a lot of VCs, and it's just a challenging market. So choose your market wisely would be one answer. But also, we've kept our burn rate incredibly light, and so we've weathered a lot of storms.
But you're VC backed?
Private equity backed.
Private equity backed, right. Alex?
So we were lucky to not have to raise VC money immediately right upon graduating from MIT because we participated in the MIT Clean Energy Prize and were lucky enough to win, which gave us a little bit of capital to start out, move out to California, and then we started fundraising early last year, in early 2016. It was definitely not easy. We pitched traditional VCs and angels, and we ended up raising $2.5 million as our first seed round, led by Founders Fund. And we also had some angels participate in that round as well, including the MIT TechU angels. And since then, we've raised some more money. We haven't been public about who is funding us more since then, but one of the big ones is actually a non-dilutive government grants, which have been really helpful, in particular from the Department of Energy. So there's a lot of there are a lot of resources available from government, especially for these research.
So you've had that mix of prize money, non-dilutive grant money, as well as some of the more traditional equity.
That's right, and it's been about half and half for us, so we've been very lucky there.
Okay.
We are VC backed. So we raised a seed about 1.5 years ago, and then raised an A this summer. And I would say it takes an enormous amount of time, and it's a huge distraction. And it's pretty painful. And as soon as you're done, you start saying, okay, now what do we need to do to raise the next one? So.
At the moment, we are entirely self-funded with equity coming from myself and my business partner in the US, as well as our partner in Australia, who actually, we were fortunate enough for him to make us a loan to buy our equity. So we have a really supportive partner in Australia who's helping us. We'll probably run out of money, I don't know, in about 18 months' time. We can probably get 3 stores and e-commerce up and running. So hopefully we'll be generating some free cash flow before we have to tackle that challenge of finding funding sources.
Right. So I wanted to ask you whether, so we've talked a little bit about that very externally facing financing, but if we can sort of turn around and look at the inside of the organization that you're leading. And I wanted to pick up on something that we talked about right at the beginning of the morning around the internal culture that you may not always know that you're developing every minute of the day, but actually is really a lot of what's happening and what you're doing. And I wondered if each of you could just reflect a bit about what sort of internal culture you're trying to create for your organization and how you think about the people that you're hiring and how you kind of organize them and motivate them. So I don't know, let's start with you, Sam.
Yeah, sure. So I actually think this is one of the best things of having your own company is that you get to have the opportunity to create your own culture. And coming from, I've worked 16 years in finance and in management consulting, and there are many things that I probably would do differently in the companies that I used to work at. And so I have this wonderful opportunity to get it right, but also to get it wrong. There's one document that I refer to all the time, and it's the Netflix PDF on culture, which I aspire to greatly. I think it's fantastic. And so whenever I sort of have a question around how we might do something, I go back to that document and I'm like, how is Netflix doing this? Because that's the company culture that that I've sort of aspired to. I mean, it came up recently when we've just started hiring employees and we're thinking about vacation policy, and we ended up deciding not to have a vacation policy because we don't have the time to track it. We just want to sort of focus on hiring great people who do the right thing. And if we make hiring errors, then we're not going to create some kind of policy to try and police the wrong people in our organization. We probably just change the people in our organization. So Netflix for me.
That's good.
I am not a founder. I am an early joiner. And the company has actually drawn from pools of people who have worked together before. So there's quite a few people who were with our founder's previous startup. And so you inherit a little bit of cultures as part of that. But it's something that we talk about an extraordinary amount. And I think one of the things that our founder, Rob May, is very open about is that he feels like with his first startup, he waited too long to start thinking about culture. And so he wanted to really start from sort of day one and be actively nurturing the culture that he wanted. And one of the things that we talk a lot about and take very seriously is this idea of being an adult. And that means all sorts of things, right? It means we don't have a vacation policy and we trust people to make the right decisions, and we don't try to police behavior through policy. We focus more on values and kind of what's the way that we want people to be able to make decisions and be accountable for themselves and treat others with respect and all the rest of it. I think when you are defining a culture, it's easy to, and we're very much in this process right now of you write down a bunch of the words, like, be bold and be nice to people and all this stuff. And you say, well, that's anywhere, right? Yeah. So how do you distill that down into something that feels unique or at least specific to that company and not just generically innovative and humble?
And so for you, what is that unique piece that you're trying to kind of access?
I think it's really that be an adult.
Right.
It's a lot about how that means respect for others, that means speak your mind, it means be accountable, do the thing you say you're going to do.
It's really interesting.
And I think in the certainly reputation of a lot of startups, particularly in the tech space, we are not a bunch of 22-year-olds playing beer pong in the afternoon. Most of us, this is not our first rodeo. We have families, we have kids. We care very much about the company that we're creating, but we also have lives. And we think it's important to be able to do both of those things well.
Great. Alex?
So we're about 10 people now, still very small, and a lot of our culture has been, I have to say, it's been organic more than I did sit down my two co-founders before founding the company even and have a discussion of what is the culture we want to create, what do we care about. And I'd say that we've had some success in being able to direct it, and a lot of it just happens naturally as well at this point. And there's always a push and pull between how much can we devote to creating that culture versus how much do we just need to focus on making a product right now. And it's always a challenge to balance those two things. And I'm usually on the side of trying to talk about creating culture, whereas my co-founders are like, yeah, but we need to build this thing first.
Right.
So I would say, when we first named the company, we called it Ayar Labs on purpose. It's because we want to be a lab first and foremost, always innovating. So we're making a product, we want to sell a lot of this product, but we also want to continue to innovate. So we don't want to just just put fiber optic communications inside data centers and call it a day. In the end, we've created this new platform, this new way of innovating where we can design optical devices and electrical devices on the same chip, which is very exciting. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist until now. And there are a lot of things we can do with that. For example, you could make, rather than having these big LiDAR devices that spin around on top of cars, you can make them on a chip, integrated into one thing. And what could you do if you could put that in a phone, in every phone, and what could you do with LiDAR in every phone? There's just examples of some of the fun things we could play with. So it's important to us to always be innovative and to attract people who care about science and inventing, even as we grow and are delivering product. And so that, I'd say, is kind of the primary part of our culture. I would say something where we could do a lot better is in hiring women, and in general in hiring. So I think part of the reason that we're so focused on innovation and being kind of researchy and making sure we have the best and brightest minds who like to invent things is also because it helps us attract people and be differentiated within the semiconductor industry. The semiconductor industry is honestly aging. There are not many graduates who know how to design chips. It's very hard to hire people, and the competition is fierce. And our competition is Apple and Intel, big companies that deliver enormous paychecks to new grads, and it's very hard to compete with as a startup. And there is a strong need to hire more women across the industry. So competition for women in this field is also incredibly fierce. So we've failed, honestly, so far in being able to have a balance of women in the company. It's something that, that's one sticking point for me. So with my two co-founders, I've sat them down recently and assessed the fact that we're not doing well on that front. And we've come up with ideas of how to improve it. So we're making sure that for every role we hire now, we interview at least a few women. So even if none of them are coming in the door naturally, we're going out and finding women to bring in and convince them to come interview if we don't have any applying in the first place, things like that.
Really?
Good. Thank you.
I think just to follow up on what you said, we have a very purpose-driven culture. We need to build a team.
Yeah.
And we're located in Mountain View, just like, a quarter mile from Google. And we don't have the bucks, we don't have the, the aura and the glamour. But so we've done a two-part strategy, which is hire mature, experienced software engineers and other leaders that want to be in a smaller environment. Some are ex-Googlers. They want the no drama. And so we can deliver no drama in a startup environment. That's pretty cool. And then
adults, no drama.
Yeah.
I think there's a theme that is emerging here about we want startups for grown-ups. Maybe.
And then the second thing we do is hire, we hire, you're not supposed to really focus on employee age, but to give you a sense of experience base, 25 to 32 or 3-year-olds, we hire them and empower them and grow them. And from the very first conversation, we say, we want to grow your career. Where are you going? Where are we going? What's that alignment? And that senior team is all invested in that growth. And I've seen it happen. We can really grow people's career. So we have self-managing, very empowered teams. This is not done because we have a culture policy. Now I'm going to go read about Netflix. It's done because we need to hire and retain. And I'll tell you it works because we have an 8-person machine learning team. It's a whole team. It's not what I call a data science as a potted plant in a corner. It's like a real team with an engineering infrastructure. And we have built and maintained that team, and some of the greatest performers are these 25-year-old guys. Because they're put into a context where they can grow and contribute from the beginning.
Yeah, thank you. Well, so a lot of this discussion about the kind of organization that you want to build and that you want to be part of, because we all have to go to our jobs every day, kind of makes me think about a topic that I think hasn't been raised, but I think is on some people's minds some of the time, which is this rather elusive thing that is known as, I think it's known as work-life balance. I'm not quite sure how, I think I'm alive when I go to work. So maybe it should be called something else, but that sort of elusive balance of how you kind of exist in your life and kind of work and find all those balancing points. Many of you, I think, have lived in different countries in the world, and so experienced that in different places or on different coasts, which I decided was the equivalent of different countries when I was thinking about this question. And so I'm just curious, without wanting to sort of descend into kind of national stereotypes or kind of right coast, left coast stereotypes, just whether or not there's some things that you've observed that are different. And I wonder whether, Catharina, you could start us off, just because you've lived in the UK, you've lived in Sweden.
Yeah, so I grew up in the US, but my mother is Swedish, and so I've maintained very strong connections to Sweden, and then lived in the UK for 7 years, right after business school, and just returned back last year. And I have found that there's just an extraordinary difference in the way that that sort of culturally people think about the role that their job plays in their life. And I've found that it does not correlate to how successful those careers are or those companies are. And I think in a lot of ways, I think the US has it wrong, quite frankly. I feel like here there is so much focus on that your job is your life. When you meet somebody in an event, the first thing you ask is, what's your name, what do you do? Right? And you go outside of the US, and that's actually considered quite rude. And they say, well, my job is this thing that I do so that I can pay for my life. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that you're any less committed to your job or your career or what you're creating. It's just a switch in how you think about how those two things fit together. So I actually made a conscious choice to have my babies overseas and then move back, when I was sort of done, right? Check that box, move on. And I'm trying really hard to think about how can I instill that into my company, right? How do I reinforce this idea that you can do both of these things? So much of, certainly at kind of this level, so much of the value that we add is thinking and being able to draw conclusions, and you can do that anywhere, right? So where do you need to be really sort of face forward and be really visible? And the flip side of that is sometimes the thing that you can do that is the most impactful is to take a vacation, right? We also have an unlimited vacation policy. And you hear about startups all the time that have an unlimited vacation policy, and that means take no vacation.
Yes.
Right? And so, fortunately, I think one of the things when you are a role model is you have to model the behavior that you want other people to do. And sometimes that means take a vacation.
Yeah. That sounds good to me. I'm not sure we believe in vacations either at MIT. And nor for our students, I think, sleep. Many of you probably remember. We always think we should trade off classes and we'll sleep when the degree is finished. But I wonder whether, Sarah, you've spent some time working, obviously, in Australia, I think,
I'm from
and
Australia,
in the United States. And so maybe you can give us a sense, especially from a sort of gendered point of view as a woman in the workplace, I know you haven't been an entrepreneur for very long, but just some of your views about that and what your experiences have been.
So I'm from Australia. I've actually lived in Spain. I covered Latin America when I was working at PIMCO in asset management. I worked in management consulting. I worked on a project for a year in South Africa and in New Zealand. And so I've worked in a lot of different countries, and I don't think anyone works as hard as people do on the East Coast as many hours, I guess, as they do on the East Coast of the US. But with that comes a lot of wonderful opportunity and professional opportunity. So I love being here because of the professional opportunity that I think this country and this part of this country, and also, the West Coast as well. But that this country affords us and offers us that you don't have in other places in the world. I mean, you look at certain parts of Europe where I think it's much harder to be successful and have opportunities as a young person, not necessarily as a man or a woman, but just as a young person. There's very high levels of unemployment. There's very sort of old ways of doing things where it's very hard, mobility within companies is very difficult. Australia is certainly, comes across as sort of more of an egalitarian place, but I think it's quite a macho culture, Australia. So I think there's a lot of hidden kind of challenges that women face in Australia, for sure. I think here, depending on the industry, I come from finance, and I think that's a difficult industry for women, for sure. Tech is, sort of a difficult industry for women. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but you started the question with work-life balance. I think right now I feel like I have more balance than I've ever had, even though I'm working more hours than I've ever worked. So I don't necessarily think that balance is an hours of working kind of a thing. It's how you feel about what you do with your time during the day. I have autonomy over my own time now. So I work more hours, but I work when I want and I do what I want when I want, which I love and I'm so grateful for. I'm not traveling to the extent that I was previously traveling, so cutting travel out of my life has been huge because I can take my kids to school in the morning, I can, I see them at night. That's amazing for me. So I think I feel like I have more balance in my life now, even though I'm working harder than I've ever worked before.
Yeah, it's a different sort of balance. I want to see if I can come around this way.
So I've only worked here in the U.S., and I think, so I actually worked for Martha Samuelson, who's known as the other Martha in my family. And I would agree with something that she said earlier this morning, which things have really changed. And so there's been periods in my life where when my kids were young and stress in the family was high and I worked part-time, which is how I worked for Martha. I actually took a few years off, and I've written books, so I filled my time, I didn't totally disengage, but it's a hard ramp to go from a cold start. You've been out of the workforce for a few years to back in, and your brain is not as good as it should be, and it does take more than 18 months. But these things back, forth, and then if you look at this panel and say startups, I'd say, do not try and do that stuff while running a startup or being in a startup. So I would just like to plant work-life balance a little bit out of the startup world and say, when you take other people's money, you have a super normal sense of responsibility. And just to conclude this, I was at a party where I was talking to the dad of a woman CEO, and she's in biotech, and she sounded very promising with a PhD in an invention, and she had gotten her Series A. And her husband was a doctor and needed special training, so they wanted to move from the San Francisco area to Seattle. And she was also pregnant. And the dad was wondering why the board was upset. And when you take other people's money and you put that level of burden on the CEO to manage stuff, it's a recipe for failure, and I don't think we should ask that of ourselves. So I would say from an entrepreneurial point of view, give yourself a whole life plan. And maybe after your kids are, in middle school or later, you might want to be an entrepreneur then. That's the beauty of how things have changed.
So I'm going to ask Alex about that.
Yeah.
You can agree and you can disagree.
I think it's nice to try to have a plan, but ultimately it's pretty hard to plan everything. So I don't know. I don't have any children, and so I feel like I'm only qualified to discuss part of this. Work-life balance is still important to me. Honestly, I think having outside investors, it's important to be responsible with their money, of course. But I honestly feel more pressure from having employees who have families and kids, and making sure that we're not going to have any risk to their paychecks that they're taking home. So that's kind of my driving motivation. And as far as work-life balance goes, I would say in my company, we've hired a lot of people with PhDs in technical topics from top universities who come to us with a culture of working themselves to the bone. Especially with recent graduates, that tends to be, with my co-founders, they came straight from finishing their PhDs and inventing this amazing breakthrough. And that came with a lot of work and kind of giving up a lot on their personal lives because they were so focused on their work even before coming to the company. And so really my driving concern in terms of work-life balance is burnout of my colleagues.
Yeah.
I think when you work that hard for so long, you end up getting into a habit of never taking vacation, of just staying late for the sake of it, even on days when you don't necessarily have to, and there's no imminent deadline. It's just habit at that point. And so for me, I've been really trying to drive my company and my colleagues to take vacation and leave early if they don't have to be there. There will be plenty of nights when they have to stay late, and it's a challenge because it's not the culture of really anyone else in my organization. But I worry that people will burn out. Burnout is a real thing, and I want my colleagues to love their jobs and love coming to work every day. And I think we have that right now. We're very lucky that we just have some really amazing people on our team who we just all love working with each other. It's interesting every day. And it's really, the highest quality group of people I've ever worked with in terms of just being surrounded by brilliant people all the time, which is amazing. And I think everyone really loves coming into the office, which is great. I also am half French, so I've grown up between two very different cultures, this US-based culture of really worshiping work, as we've discussed, as well as the French-based culture where everyone is on vacation for the entire month of August. And takes 2-hour lunches every day. And so I've grown up really valuing the power of vacation. I've tended to have my own best ideas, I found, when I leave for a week and I do nothing. And then I think of things I never would have in the go of my daily life. So I really treasure having vacation as a time to really re-energize my work life, too.
I like that. I think those are some important ideas that we're collecting up. And I think the idea that in the startups you actually get to be part of the co-creation of the culture, and you can start to embed those ideas and nurture the talent that you've all been talking about, but at the same time nurture that capacity for people to be their whole selves, I think is really important. I'm going to open up to questions because, the professor that I am, I could ask questions all day, and I love my panelists, and I'd be happy to chat with them up until lunchtime. So there's a question over there. And one over there, I'm already seeing.
I would just make a slight comment. When you're saying, get your kids done, pretty much, and then go on and be a venture capitalist. I have kids. Go from 22 to 14 and a half, 4. And I can't, my experience at least is that it's not easier when they get bigger. The older they are, the more time you need. It was a lot easier to manage when they were little than when they were big.
Yeah, just to speak to that specifically, my point was specifically around maternity leave.
Yeah, I understood that,
but yes.
No, I think that's, I would say my kids are in grad school, and so I've been through that whole cycle. I agree with you. There's periods in which, they're kind of like movable objects, and then there's periods when you just want to, that's why I took 3 years off. I needed to be at home during a certain period. And so you have to play it as it comes, yeah.
But also in terms of culture, France, we do have 4 weeks off in the summer, or 3, depending. But we finish at 8 or 9 every day. Yeah. So, and I don't think this is the culture here. People around, except in the city maybe, but people around 6, 7, 8, they're home. In Europe, people go home very late. So work balance is difficult because you do have long gaps, long periods with your kids, but then you don't see them for weeks.
Yeah. I think, Martha, you opened up a nice space for controversy, which we always like on panels. We don't want everybody to agree. So I think the conception of how we all think about the relationship between where our careers are when and when we have children and how that all works out is one that we all manage in really different ways. What I think is so interesting about entrepreneurship is the fact that it does afford some different ability to make some different kinds of choices. Really hard ones still, but sort of around timing and how we construct our lives. Now, there are some more people with questions over here.
Hi, Bridget McDermott. I love the discussion on innovation. One of the things that I just wanted to raise was this is, and I think this happens a lot with MIT, is very focused on the entrepreneurship side of it. There's also innovation that's happening in corporates and in larger IT companies. I'm at IBM right now. I'm working on blockchain, which to me is the most exciting technology happening out there. And I think that as we think about innovation, as we think about opportunities for all of us, sort of tying it to it has to be a startup with all of the kinds of things we're talking about here, that can actually make the idea of innovation more scary or harder to achieve. I have a complete female reporting structure, complete all the way up to the chairman of the board in my organization. We have basically a startup environment inside of a massive corporation where in the last 2 years we've built from absolutely zero to a business of multiple hundreds of people. And we've had the opportunity to shape culture, and we've had the opportunity to work with startups and with big corporates to drive some real innovation. And so I just want us, as we think about how do we, with the benefit we have with Sloan, with the benefit we have with technology, not get stuck in we all have to do it ourselves with a startup. It's, there's phenomenal money and investment and ideas in industry. There's phenomenal investment in big companies, and there's phenomenal investment in energy in entrepreneurship and then academia, right? Like bring them all together, and can we do a better job of that? And can we as women help sort of bring that together and use it ourselves for that work-life balance and for that, impact? I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess it's not a question, but it's.
So I have a comment about that, which is I mentioned to you that I'd spoken. I mean, frankly, if you're a PhD from MIT, you can get in to see any VC. You're just a weird thing. They want to see who you are, and so that wasn't my problem. But I have been told many times, oh, your company's great, you're great, and you're not venturable. It's a verb or something, And so and I think that's actually was true. I didn't want to hear it, but it's actually true. So I would claim that some industries, the center of innovation should come from larger companies with bigger balance sheets, and that is probably very true in energy markets, which are so highly volatile and capital intense. And so that makes the locus of innovation, if you take that framework, really much broader than startups.
I would agree. I mean, I think certainly at MIT, one of the activities on campus that I lead is this innovation initiative. And the reason it's an innovation initiative, not an entrepreneurship initiative, is precisely to your point, which is that we're thinking about taking ideas all the way through to impact. And that can often be the university at the beginning. It can then be startups, it can then be large corporations, it can be the partnership between them, and sometimes it's all happening in corporate R&D labs. And so I think that that mix is really what makes this so important, and a lot of this then means that we have to manage across boundaries of different types of organizations. And so I'm curious whether or not any of you have seen places where those boundaries have worked well, or places where you've seen them work sort of disastrously, and that sort of relationship between the startup and a larger organization just hasn't, or with the university, hasn't been as effective as you'd like it to be.
So I took your class at MIT, Innovation Team.
You did.
And I can vouch that Fiona and the team that taught that class did very much make this point, that you don't need a startup to innovate. And a lot of the question is, what is the best way to get this invention, turn this invention into an innovation that's useful and get it into the world? And it can be in a partnership with a big company. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. So I absolutely agree. And I don't even think MIT is preaching that you have to do a startup. But I do think that big companies and startups each have their role. So my field is one that has been around. There's been a lot of research both in big companies as well as in academia, and there have been a lot of startups in this field of trying to get chips to communicate using light. And I think the reason that we were able to achieve what we did, which was the first ever processor to communicate using light, is because we were not part of a big company, and we weren't restricted by kind of the frame of mind of big company thinking, and really challenged conventional wisdom, which is that you have to have a specific manufacturing process for chips that works to manipulate light in silicon, basically. And instead, question, do you or can you use a standard processor manufacturing process to make chips manipulate light well. So basically, it was a very different way of thinking about it. And
So you could kind of break the boundaries because you're changing the organization. And you're doing something in a new place.
Can I ask you 2 questions? How do you scale the manufacturing? Do you need to be a big company? Is that capital intense? And how do you go to market? Do you need to do partnerships, or will you sell directly to market? Because these are the boundaries of startup and big companies. I'm curious.
Yeah. So something that makes it possible for us to even be a startup is that we don't have to do our own manufacturing. We're a fabless semiconductor company, and the innovation is that we can piggyback on the semiconductor manufacturing industry.
You can
that
use
already
existing
exists.
fab infrastructure and the existing
Yeah, with no
foundries.
change. So fabs that are built to make electronics, we kind of hacked into and figured out how to get them to make photonics as well. So that enables us to manufacture without having to build billion-dollar foundries. And as far as how do we go to market, absolutely, it's through partnerships with big companies. We could also partner with startups. There are a lot of interesting companies we can partner with that are both big companies and startups, but I honestly think it's much better to partner with big companies because you don't want to pile risk on top of risk. So it's an ecosystem, and I think it's important. And what I've experienced is that the big companies have been very willing and open to work with us. They're excited to bring in innovation and partner with us to make new product lines for themselves. And so the ecosystem is important, both the big companies and the small ones.
Other questions that people have?
Yeah. Me? Okay. Sorry. My name is Miranda Albeck. I'm MBA 2001. And 1 year after I finished Sloan, I left consulting company to open a gymnastics school. And at the beginning, culture and entrepreneurship was easy because we had a small team. But we've grown a lot, and I have a little different challenge than most people here. Like, everybody's talking about how we increase female presence on board, in companies, in executive. I run a staff of 45 females from ages 15 to 55. And my challenge is, how do I manage the drama? She looked across the carpet to me this way, and she must not like me. And bring some, professionalism and stability and factual. We do business here. We're a big business now. We need to be professional. We don't really judge the other person across the room. It's like, oh, she gave me that look, or she's not talking to me. She didn't say hi. She should be upset. I feel like I'm on a monthly drama and turning into a therapist or a counselor of a sort to 45 people on staff at 600 students and their mothers and their grandmothers and sometimes their fathers. So maybe the answer is not going to come from the board, maybe from the room if anyone else is experienced. But I would appreciate some ideas. Thank you.
So I'm going to try.
Go on, Catharina.
The last company that I worked at was a video games company called King, best known for Candy Crush. And part of what I loved about the video games industry was you had this incredible and rare combination of incredibly creative, passionate, sometimes emotional people, and very, very data-driven, business-focused, revenue-generating environment, right? And so you had game teams that consist of engineers and artists and data scientists and marketers and community and all the rest of it in one big messy slop. And it was amazing and hard to figure out how do you get all of those people to work together in a way where the team and the output is greater than the sum of its parts. And what worked for me, which was something that I learned from our CEO, Riccardo Zacconi, was just to have a no tolerance for politics approach of when you have those conversations, I think she looked at me funnily from across the room and therefore it doesn't mean she doesn't like me, to say, okay, let's just get everybody in the room, right? Always just get everybody in the room, you guys talk it out, because you don't have time to be everybody's therapist, and you need grown-ups.
I mean, I think you're describing, we often think about this because of the context, I think, of the workplace, of this idea of having diversity and having representation of women and men in teams and organizations. It obviously works in both directions, right? All women, all men, right? means that we don't have the sort of diversity. And I think what I also like, that I've heard from all of you, right, is this needing to have this quite complex mix of that very business focus, the design focus in fashion or wherever it might be, and that sort of design sensibility, the scientists, the inventors, and it's a whole collection of really different kinds of people. And I think Judy referred to that as well. One of the questions was around how you manage the egos of the scientists with the sort of the finance people. And so it's always that diversity that is, I think the culture comes from how we often deal with those sort of conflicting patterns of individuals. Now, there was somebody over here who had a question, I think.
Yeah, my question is about cultivation of moxie. Cultivation of the...
Could you translate that for me?
The spitfire to innovate, the confidence, the courage to, whether it's in a large company setting, I'm reminded of the other Martha's comment this morning of, in the end, it's about selling.
The other Martha.
Selling, to get investment, it's about selling to get resources, it's about selling. I'm just curious what this group's thoughts are on that topic.
Okay. So I'm going to translate moxie, I think, as you said, as the confidence. I sometimes like to think about it as the performance, right? The sort of the performance of self, especially when you're trying to be in these quite public environments, raising money, but also internally. So I think, Sarah, you're helping us with that, with our own personal brand and what we wear when we perform, which I think is actually very important.
I was like, what does that mean? Yeah, so I think what we're trying to do through giving women comfortable, confidence-building clothing is to help with personal branding. And so, a lot of that, for us, it can come through clothing, and that's just a small element. It's what you look like and how you feel and how you come across. I know, I don't know if anybody's seen the Amy Cuddy TED Talk, that's sort of about, she does this before she goes out and speaks publicly because that sort of position increases the serotonin in your brain, which makes you more confident and makes you, that sort of translates to a more confident approach. So there are different ways to try and create a better personal brand, and ultimately you're selling, right? So ultimately sales is everything, and I think confidence is the most important thing about that. So for us it's through clothing, but for others maybe there's something else that...
Martha, how do you?
I think it's a two-part answer, and kind of going back to the dilemma of the gym employees. I used to teach at Boston University, and it's quite a different institution. And I'm going to talk about Boston University like more than 20 years ago. So it's different today than it was, and it's very different than MIT. And so when I taught undergraduates there, I noticed that some of them would freeze frame in a case study class. And it turned out, I found out through office conversation, that they did not have dinner table conversations at home where an idea could be put in the middle and batted around intellectually. That you had this, your dad would come down on you hard if you said something stupid kind of environment. So there was no emotional distance from an idea. So I hire on that ability and that practice of being intellectually dispassionate about ideas and being able to share. So that gives you a foundation for empowered teams. And last week we had a last-minute customer call, maybe 10 days ago, and it was at the eve of the Jewish New Year, and I'm like heading out to the door to fund dinner. I'm like, oh my God, what are we going to do? So I called the VP of engineering, who was also heading out of the door for dinner, and she called some of our 25-year-olds and said, we need a demo, and it needs to do this stuff. And we came back the afternoon of the next day, and it was done, and it's great, and it's just knocking people over. It's showing our machine learning, which is so geeky. It's showing it really in a very transparent way. That's the power of the empowered team. So I think for me, it's like you set that culture of who you hire, you have that culture that reinforces that empowered team, and you get these wonderful moments. That was like a career high for me to think that these two 25-year-old guys did that in 4 hours with no, older adult supervision. It's like pretty amazing.
Yeah. Alex?
So I guess there are two parts. There's creating the culture internally in the organization, and then also personally, how do we ourselves do it? I agree. We hire on that. We very much have a culture of needing to be able to challenge each other and be open and honest and logical about how we discuss trade-offs and ideas, and not take offense when someone is poking holes in an idea. We have weekly meetings where the whole team will get together and people will present what they're working on, and then other people, even if they work on something entirely different and are not experts in the topic, will ask questions. And you need to have an environment where there's this feeling that there's no such thing as a stupid question. I think that's number one. And then number two is also just hiring people who are able to do that and aren't scared to speak up, to kind of create that culture in the first place. And I'd say for me personally, how do I project confidence? I'd say especially when I started fundraising, that was a tough one because I'm in a very specific field where people in the semiconductor industry tend to have been in it their whole lives, and I was an outsider. And I would say, honestly, for me, it's about not making it about myself. I have a real passion and belief that this technology is going to change the world. And if I keep my mind on that, about getting that message across, and not about who it is delivering it, I find very quickly that other people around the table become focused on the ideas, not on the person who's saying it. So as long as I can get past the first, people seeing what I look like and get them to pay attention to what I'm saying, then it usually is pretty good from there.
Right. Catharina, how do you think about that?
So I very much credit my time at MIT Sloan with being really transformative for me in that way. I think before business school, I would have said, well, I haven't had experience in doing this thing. I haven't had no formal training in doing this thing, therefore I cannot do this thing. And I certainly cannot tell anybody else how to do this thing. And I think one of the most powerful takeaways for me from my time at Sloan was I might not know how to do that thing, but I know I can figure out how to get that thing done, which is not the same thing as me doing it, no. But that I know that I can figure out how to solve that problem. And that has just been an incredibly powerful sort of thing to have in my pocket. And something that I try to coach my team with as much as I can, to say, in order to deliver the thing doesn't mean you have to know the thing, right? You have to understand it, and you have to understand what it requires and figure out how to get it done, and that is an important distinction.
Yeah. I agree, and actually something I love about being an entrepreneur is that by definition, no one has ever done what we're doing before. No one has any idea what the right answer is on a number of questions we ask ourselves every day. And that's part of what's fun about it. And really everyone's winging it. We're all just trying to figure it out. We try to get as much input and advice from people who've done similar things in the past as we can. But in the end, it's just confidence in knowing no one knows the right answer. Pick something and move forward. And I have fun with that. I like it.
I sometimes think about this also as just once you learn the ability to say you don't know, I at least found that very empowering, especially in the classroom, is with lots of people asking you questions. I'm looking at Antoinette. I think we both had some of the same teaching experience. When you get to a point where you can say you don't know, but let's think about it, it's that shared journey of thinking about something that is quite empowering, I think, to be able to do that. Now, I understand somebody has the microphone. There's one last question. No pressure.
Oh, it's okay. I'll try to wrap it up because I have a little bit to say about, including what Bridget said. So, I have a PhD in structural engineering, high-performance computing, and I went to Sloan. And structural engineering, full of guys. There are no women PhDs. So after Sloan, I wanted to go to a structural engineering company, so I interviewed at Bechtel. There were no women in management, zero. So I got intimidated and went to IBM. In incubators, they had a program called EBOs. And actually, people were tying edge innovation, and probably you studied this, Fiona. They spoke about the whale with little tentacles, so I was in 4 EBOs, and they were the tentacles in the large company. And the nice thing in IBM, I didn't need to deal with the women thing, ever. And there were women in my reporting chain, and there were women groups, and they were encouraging each other and pushing to change jobs every 2 or 3 years. And it was wonderful. And other people in IBM don't experience that, I realize that. But in this case, they were it was a group of people supporting each other and doing innovation. And another thing I learned there is that, and I like the startup environment much more than IBM, because IBM has no patience. And I think the larger companies, you were speaking about innovation, large companies, no patience. Like, they give the little startup incubators 2 years, and then they start measuring quarter-to-quarter return, and sometimes revenue. So I wonder if you studied this, and I went.
You should never, at the end of a thing, ask a professor if they've studied something and what they think, because I may just suddenly burst forth into a lecture. For the sake of everybody at lunch, let me just thank my panelists and thank the audience for some great questions, and I hope we can, over lunch, continue these conversations. But I also think there are a few remarks just to help us wrap up for lunch.
So thank you, Fiona, and thank you, all the panelists, for such an energetic discussion. My name is Carla Avila, and I'm from the MBA class of 1997. And yes, we have a few of us here today. Before we break for lunch, I'd like to remind you of an activity that we'd love to have, we hope that you could do during lunch. And that is to talk to each other about 3 topics in preparation for our next session after lunch with Renee Richardson-Gosselin. And the idea is for us to talk about 3 topics, and you can choose one. I think they're very broad topics and very interesting ones. And one of them is the blessing or the curse of technology in leadership and personal branding. That's one of them. The second one is the expectations of you, of yourself or others in your career, given an MIT degree, or for the matter of the people that are here that are not from MIT, from any other degrees that you have. And the third one would be to share best practices on how to build a personal brand. So from the topics that we were talking here before, and in anticipation of the next session, it would be great if you could discuss these 3 topics. So thank you. And we can go to the tower room.
Great. And thank you again to the panelists.